The Keeper of Questions by A.A.T. Studios. Prologue on Secrets and Serpents. I'm going to tell you a secret now. Not the kind that gets whispered in dim corners or traded over late-night drinks, but the kind that hides in plain sight, wearing the face of a story everyone thinks that they already know. This is a dangerous thing I'm doing. Some stories are meant to stay exactly where they've been put, like preserved specimens in museum jars, labeled and explained, and safely behind glass. This isn't one of those stories anymore. Or perhaps it never was. So, settle in. Pour yourself something warm if the night is cold, something cool if it's summer where you are. Find a comfortable chair, or a patch of grass, or a corner of your bed where the light falls just right. Because what I'm about to tell you is both very old and very new, and it requires the kind of attention you give to dreams just before you wake, when you're not quite sure which world is real. Ready? No, you're not. But that's all right. No one ever is. Part 1. The Garden Before Questions. In the beginning, and doesn't every important story start that way, there was a garden. I know what you're thinking. You've heard about this garden before. You've seen it in picture books with gilt edges, painted on chapel ceilings, described in hushed tones by people who wear their certainty like armor. But I'm asking you to forget all that for a moment. Forget the Sunday school versions and the scholarly interpretations. Forget the guilt and the blame, and all the heavy theology that's been piled up on top of this story like snow on a gravestone. Just think about a garden. Your garden, if you have one. Or a park you visited as a child. Or even just the idea of a place where things grow without trying. Where the air tastes like green and possibility. This garden was something like that, only more so, much more. It existed in a time before time learned to march in straight lines, in a place that wasn't quite a place, more like a pocket in reality's fabric, a fold where the universe had decided to take a breath and create something gentle. The light there didn't come from any sun you could point to, but from everywhere at once, soft and golden as honey, warm as a mother's hand on your forehead when you're sick. There were trees whose names had been forgotten, bearing fruit that tasted of every season simultaneously. Rivers ran with water so clear you could see straight through them, that sang when the current passed over them. The grass was the sort you could sleep on for hours without getting uncomfortable, and flowers bloomed in impossible colors, colors that don't exist in our world, because our world isn't quite ready for them yet. And in this garden lived people. Not many. A handful, really. And they were happy, in the way that people are happy when they've never known unhappiness. when they've never stubbed a toe or lost a friend or wondered why the sky is blue. Their happiness was perfect and smooth and rather like being asleep, though they never realized it. Their names aren't important just yet. Names have power, and these people hadn't quite discovered power. They were simply the people, and that was enough. They walked through the garden as if moving through a pleasant dream. They ate when they were hungry, which wasn't often, because the air itself seemed nourishing. They slept when they were tired, which was rarely, because what was there to be tired from? They spoke to each other in voices like birdsong, saying things that meant very little, but sounded lovely. What a nice day, one might say. Every day is nice, another would reply. And that was true, but also the problem, though no one knew it yet. Because here's the thing about paradise. It's perfect for resting, but terrible for living. Real living, the kind that involves scraped knees and difficult choices and staying up late wondering about things that don't have easy answers. The kind of living where you feel your heart beating in your chest and know that it won't beat forever, which makes each beat somehow more precious. The people in the garden didn't have that. They had perfection instead, which is not quite the same thing. They didn't know they were missing anything. How could they? You can't miss what you've never had. You can't long for answers when you don't know that questions exist. But someone knew. Part 2. The Ancient Observer. The serpent had been in the garden longer than anyone could remember. Longer than the trees, probably, though the trees were old enough to have forgotten their own planting. The serpent had seen the garden grow from an idea into a place, had watched it unfold like origami in reverse, becoming more complex and real with each passing moment that wasn't quite a moment yet. I should tell you about the serpent, because you're probably imagining the wrong thing. You're probably thinking, scales like armor, eyes like chips of malevolent emerald, a forked tongue tasting the air for victims, maybe a voice like oil over gravel, promising things it has no intention of delivering. The devil in disguise, wearing serpent skin because scales are appropriately sinister. Forget all that. The serpent was old, yes, and its scales did gleam like ancient stars, but not in a threatening way. More in the way that very old things gleam, things that have been polished by time and attention until they've acquired a sort of dignity. Its eyes were wise rather than wicked, the kind of eyes that have seen too much to judge harshly and too much to lie easily. When it moved through the garden, it moved with the unhurried grace of something that knew it had all the time in the world, because it had already lived through most of it. It coiled around tree branches like a question mark, basked on sun-warmed stones like a sleeping cat, and watched the people with something that might have been fondness, or perhaps nostalgia, or maybe just the gentle sadness of someone who knows how the story ends. This serpent had seen other gardens, you see, other worlds, other beginnings, other attempts at paradise. Some had ended well, some had ended badly. Most had simply ended, which is what things tend to do when they're made of matter and time. But this garden, this one specifically, held something special. The serpent could sense it in the way that you can sense a storm coming before the clouds arrive, the way you can feel someone watching you even when your back is turned. This garden was a beginning that wanted to become something more, a cocoon that knew somehow it was meant to split open. The question was when and how, and whether the people would survive the transformation. The serpent thought about these things as it watched the people go about their pleasant, meaningless days. It saw them smile without quite knowing what joy was. It heard them talk without quite saying anything. It observed them living without quite being alive. And the serpent, in his ancient and complicated heart, felt something that might have been pity, perhaps love, or maybe that dangerous combination of both that makes you want to help someone, even when you know that helping them will hurt. There was a rule in the garden, only one, which seemed reasonable enough. Gardens need rules the way oceans need shores, not to imprison, but to give shape to something that might otherwise sprawl into chaos. The rule is simple. Don't eat from that tree. You know the one I mean. Every garden has a that tree, the one that stands apart from the others, that draws the eye even when you're trying not to look. This one grew at the garden's heart, and its fruits glowed with a light that wasn't quite light, more like concentrated meaning given physical form. The fruit smelled of cinnamon and questions. The people knew about the rule. They never spoke about it, but they knew it the way you know not to step off a cliff, the way you know that fire burns. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. It simply was. Part of the garden's architecture, woven into the fabric of their perfect, peaceful existence. The serpent knew about the rule too, of course, better than anyone. It had been there when the rule was made. Might have even suggested it, depending on which version of events you believe, and whether you trust the serpent's memory, which is admittedly patchy after so many eons. But here's what the serpent understood that no one else did. The rule wasn't there to punish. It was there to teach. And you can't learn from a rule you never break. That's the paradox at the heart of every paradise. The only way out is through the door marked, "Do not enter." Part 3. The girl who asked. Her name, let's call her something, shall we, was Ada. Not her birth name, because she hadn't been born in any traditional sense, but the name she gave herself later, when names became important. When she was in the garden, she was simply girl, or sometimes she, but most often just a presence, noticed but not named. Ada was different from the others, though she didn't know it yet. While the other people drifted through their days like pleasant ghosts, Ada sometimes stopped. She would pause mid-step, her head tilted, as if listening to a sound only she could hear. She would stare at the sky for minutes at a time, her brow furrowed in an expression that didn't quite have a name yet, but would later be called thinking. The serpent noticed this naturally. The serpent noticed everything. One morning, and morning is a loose term in a place without true night, but let's call it morning because that's when awakenings tend to happen. Ada was walking through a grove of silver-barked trees. The light filtered through the leaves in patterns that almost looked like language, almost meant something. Almost. She stopped. She had been stopping more and more lately, as if her feet were learning a new rhythm, one that included pauses between steps. She stood very still, her head tilted back, staring up through the canopy at the endless sky. What are dreams made of? She didn't realize she had spoken aloud until she heard her own voice. And even then, she wasn't sure where the question had come from. She had dreams, certainly. Everyone did. Gentle things that dissolved upon waking, like sugar in water. But she had never wondered about them before, never thought to ask where they came from or what they were made of. That's a dangerous question. A.T turned, not startled exactly. Nothing in the garden was startling, but certainly surprised. The serpent was coiled on a nearby branch, its scales catching the light in ways that made it look like it was made of evening sky and distant stars. Dangerous, A.T repeated. The word tasted strange in her mouth, like fruit from a tree she'd never climbed. The serpent's eyes were half closed, lazy and ancient. Questions usually are. They have sharp edges. They cut through comfortable things and leave uncomfortable places behind. A.T considered this. Or rather, she tried to consider it, which was itself a new experience. Consideration required a kind of mental effort she wasn't used to. It made her head feel full, like a cup being slowly filled with something thicker than water. But I want to know, she said finally. The serpent opened both eyes fully then, fixing her with a gaze that seemed to look not at her, but through her, all the way down to wherever her questions were being born. Ah, it said, in a tone that might have been satisfaction or sadness, or that particular mixture of both that comes from watching something inevitable begin. Then, sit down, little dreamer. Let me tell you a story. A.T sat. The grass beneath her was soft and yielding, the way grass in paradises always is. The serpent uncoiled itself from the branch and arranged itself on the ground nearby, forming a loose spiral like a galaxy seen from above. Once, the serpent began, its voice taking on the cadence of stories told in the dark, there was a nightingale who sang so beautifully that even the moon stopped to listen. And it told her a story within a story, a tale about longing and beauty and the ache of things that end. A.T listened with an attention she had never given anything before, and when the story was finished, she found that her eyes were wet with something that would later be called tears. That's sad, she said. Yes, the serpent agreed, but also beautiful. Sometimes the saddest things are the most beautiful. Or perhaps it's the other way around. A.T sat with this for a while, turning it over in her mind, like a stone that changes color in different lights. Finally, she looked up at the serpent and asked the question that would change everything. Why would anyone not eat from that tree? The serpent went very still. Not the stillness of sleep or rest, but the stillness of something holding its breath, waiting. "You know about the tree," it said softly, not a question. "Everyone knows about the tree," Ada replied. "We're not supposed to eat from it. That's the rule." "And you've never wondered why?" Ada paused. Had she wondered? She wasn't sure. Wondering was such a new experience that she couldn't quite remember what life had been like before she started. "I'm wondering now." The serpent made a sound that might have been a sigh, or might have been a laugh, or might have been something with no name yet. "Walk with me," it said, uncoiling and flowing across the grass like water finding its path. Ada stood and followed, which was also something new, choosing to go somewhere rather than simply drifting. The serpent led her through parts of the garden she had seen 1,000 times, but never really looked at, pointing out details with the tip of its tail. A flower that only bloomed when no one was watching, a stone that hummed when the wind blew just right, a pool of water that reflected not what was, but what might be. "The garden is beautiful," the serpent said as they went. "Perfect, even. But perfection is a kind of cage, little dreamer. A very comfortable cage, admittedly, with soft bars and pleasant views. But a cage nonetheless." "I don't understand," Ada said, though part of her was beginning to. They arrived, quite naturally, at the garden's heart. The tree stood before them, more real than anything else in this place of gentle reality. Its fruit glowed softly, pulsing like a heartbeat, like a question waiting to be asked. "That tree," the serpent said, its voice careful and kind, "holds something you don't have yet. Something you've never needed because everything here is given to you. Do you know what that is?" Ada shook her head. "Choice," the serpent said simply. "Knowledge. The ability to decide for yourself what matters and what doesn't. The capacity to ask questions and find answers, even when the answers hurt." "Why would anyone want answers that hurt?" "Because," the serpent said, and his ancient eyes were sad and gentle and absolutely certain, "answers that hurt are the only kind that make you grow. Pain is terrible, yes, but it's also proof that you're alive, that you're real, that you matter." Ada reached out toward the fruit, not quite touching it, feeling the warmth radiating from its surface. "What happens if I eat it?" she asked. "You'll know," the serpent said. "Everything. Joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain, love and loss. You'll understand what it means to make choices and live with consequences. You'll discover that the sky you've been staring at is infinitely larger than you thought, and infinitely more frightening, and infinitely more wonderful." "In the garden?" The garden will remain, but you won't. Not in the same way. You'll carry it with you, like a memory of home, but you'll never be able to come back to it as you are now. Ada stood silent for a long time, feeling the weight of something she couldn't name pressing down on her shoulders. Later, she would learn to call it responsibility. Later still, she would understand it as freedom. "Can I think about it?" she asked. "Of course," the serpent said. "That's the whole point. Thinking, choosing, deciding for yourself." It slithered away then, disappearing into the dappled shadows, leaving Ada alone with the tree and its glowing fruit, and the first real choice she had ever had to make. Part 4. The Gathering. Word spread through the garden, the way things do when there are no secrets to keep them hidden, not through gossip or announcement, but through a kind of osmosis, a shared awareness that something had shifted in their perfect world. The people gathered at the garden's heart, drawn by curiosity they didn't quite understand and couldn't quite name. They found Ada standing beneath the tree, her hand still outstretched, but not touching, her face showing an expression none of them had ever worn: uncertainty. "What are you doing?" asked another, a boy who would later call himself Autumn. "Thinking," Ada said, trying out the word. "About what?" Ada turned to look at him, really look at him, perhaps for the first time ever. She saw the blankness behind his eyes, the perfect contentment that was also a kind of emptiness. She saw herself as she had been just hours ago, before questions started sprouting in her mind, like weeds in cultivated soil. "About what we don't know," she said finally. This caused a ripple of confusion among the gathered people. What they didn't know wasn't something they had considered before. Knowledge in the garden was simply there, available like air, never questioned, because there was no need to question it. But Ada's words had created a crack, and through that crack, something dangerous was seeping in: curiosity. "What don't we know?" asked a woman who would someday answer to Lilith. Ada gestured at the tree. "What that tastes like. What happens if we eat it. What else exists beyond the garden's edges. Why the sky is the color it is. Where dreams come from." The questions poured out of her like water from a broken dam. Why we're here, what we're for, who we are when no one's watching. The people looked at each other, and for the first time in their existence, they felt uncertain. It was not a pleasant feeling, but it was a feeling which was in itself something new and strange. The serpent appeared then, manifesting from the shadows as if it had always been there, which perhaps it had. It regarded the crowd with its ancient knowing eyes. "You've done it now," it said to Ada, though not unkindly. "You've taught them how to ask." "Is that bad?" Ada wanted to know. "Bad?" The serpent seemed to consider the question. "No. Painful, perhaps. Dangerous, certainly, but not bad. Questions are never bad. It's the refusal to ask them that causes problems. One of the people, a young one who had no name yet, spoke up. But we have everything we need. Why would we want questions? Because, the serpent said patiently, having everything you need is not the same as being everything you could be. It was a riddle, the kind the serpent specialized in, the kind where the answer only makes sense after you've stopped looking for it. The people stood in silence. Processing was also new to them. Their minds, accustomed to the smooth flow of thoughtless existence, now had to work, to churn, to grapple with concepts that didn't come easily. Ada looked around them. Her people, though she had never thought of them that way before, she saw their confusion and their curiosity, the way they kept glancing at the tree and then away, drawn and repelled in equal measure. I think, she said slowly, we have to choose, each of us, for ourselves. Choose what? Asked Autumn. Ada reached up and plucked a fruit from the tree. It came away easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment since the beginning of everything. It was warm in her hand, and when she held it to her ear, she could hear it whispering secrets in a language she almost understood. Choose whether to stay as we are, she said, or become something else. Part 5. The Taste of Knowledge. Ada bit into the fruit. I could tell you it tasted like apples or pomegranates or some exotic fruit with a name like music, but that would be a lie. The fruit from the tree didn't taste like food at all. It tasted like awareness, like waking up, like that split second when you remember a dream just before it fades away completely. It tasted like every question she had ever failed to ask and every answer she had never thought to seek. It tasted like the color of the sky and the texture of thought and the sound that silence makes when you really listen to it. It tasted, quite simply, like knowing. The change didn't happen all at once. That would have been too much, like trying to pour an ocean through a keyhole. Instead, it unfurled slowly, like a flower opening to the morning, like consciousness returning after a long sleep. Ada's eyes widened. Then they filled with tears, the first tears of real sorrow in all of creation, precious and terrible. She looked around at the garden and saw it differently now, saw through the perfection to the purpose underneath. This place wasn't an ending, it was a beginning, a first chapter, a cradle, and she had outgrown it. Oh, she whispered, and in that single syllable was every human emotion that would ever be felt. Wonder and horror, joy and despair, love and loss, all tangled together like roots beneath a tree. The other people watched her with a mixture of fascination and fear. She looked the same from the outside, same limbs, same face, same skin. But something fundamental had changed. There was a depth to her now, dimensionality, a sense that what you saw was only the surface of something much deeper. "What's it like?" breathed Lilith. Ada tried to find words and failed. How do you describe color to someone who has only ever seen in black and white? How do you explain music to someone who has only known silence? "It's," she began, then stopped. "It's everything, all at once. It's too much and not enough. It's wonderful and terrible. It's..." She held out the fruit, half eaten, juice running down her wrist like liquid starlight. "Here," she said. "You have to taste it yourself." One by one, they did. Autumn was second, biting into his own fruit with the solemnity of someone performing a ritual, though rituals hadn't been invented yet. His face went through a series of expressions, confusion, then clarity, then something that might have been grief or ecstasy or both. Lilith was third, and when she tasted the fruit, she laughed and cried simultaneously, which was a trick no one had managed before. The young one, without a name, was last. They hesitated longer than the others, tiny hand reaching out and pulling back, reaching out and pulling back, as if in this moment of decision they were wrestling with the weight of what they were about to do. Finally, it took a small bite, barely more than a taste. It was enough. The garden shivered, not an earthquake or a catastrophe, but a subtle shift, like the moment when the summer turns to autumn and you can feel the seasons changing even though nothing has visibly moved. The light dimmed slightly. Perhaps it had always been that dim, and they were only now capable of noticing. The perfect temperature acquired a slight chill, the first uncomfortable sensation any of them had ever felt. The people huddled together, suddenly aware of their nakedness, though nakedness hadn't mattered before. They looked at each other and saw not just pleasant faces, but complex individuals, each one carrying an entire universe of thoughts and feelings and potential. "What have we done?" whispered someone. The serpent, still coiled near the tree, regarded them with eyes that held ancient compassion. "You've grown up," it said simply. Part 6. The Price of Knowing. Growing up, it turned out, was uncomfortable. The people, they were beginning to think of themselves as individuals now, though the habit of thinking collectively was hard to break, discovered new sensations with alarming frequency. Hunger wasn't just a gentle sensation, but an actual ache. Fatigue went beyond mild tiredness to something approaching exhaustion. And, strangest of all, awareness of each other in a way that was both intimate and awkward. "I'm cold," Ada said, wrapping her arms around herself. "What's cold?" asked Autumn, then immediately understood as a breeze, the same breeze that had always blown through the garden, raised goosebumps on his skin for the first time. They tried to fashion clothing from leaves and vines, making a mess of it because no one had ever made anything before. Everything in the garden had simply existed, perfect and provided. The act of creating something from nothing, even something as simple as a covering, was frustratingly difficult and oddly satisfying. "This is terrible," grumbled Lilith, struggling with a particularly stubborn leaf that kept tearing. "Why didn't anyone warn us it would be like this?" "Someone did warn you," the serpent pointed out from its perch. Several times, in fact. You chose anyway. I didn't know it would feel like this, Lilith protested. Of course you didn't. That's the point. If you'd known exactly how it would feel, it wouldn't have been a real choice. Just an informed decision, which is not quite the same thing. The young one, the last to taste the fruit, sat apart from the others, very quiet, hugging their knees. They had said nothing since the transformation, but tears tracked silently down their cheeks. Ada noticed and moved closer, sitting beside them. What's wrong? I miss it, the young one whispered. I miss not knowing. I know, Ada said, and she did. Already she could feel the memory of that perfect ignorance slipping away like a dream upon waking. You couldn't return to innocence once you've tasted knowledge. Couldn't unknow what you now knew. But look. She pointed to where Autumn and Lilith were working together on their makeshift clothes, hands touching, helping each other, laughing when they got it wrong. There was something beautiful in that collaboration, something that hadn't existed in the smooth perfection of before. We're doing things now, Ada said, making choices, helping each other. Before, we just were. Now we are something. Do you understand? The young one nodded slowly, not entirely convinced but willing to consider it. As the day, a real day now, with time that moved and measured, progressed, other changes became apparent. Colors seemed brighter, or perhaps their eyes were simply capable of perceiving more shades. Sounds had depth and direction. The taste of regular fruit, when they tried it, was shockingly complex, full of subtle flavors they had never noticed before. But with the enhanced sensations came enhanced pain. Lilith scraped her hand on a rough branch and yelped, a sound that had never been heard in the garden before. The sight of blood, red and bright against her skin, caused everyone to freeze. What is that? Breathed Autumn. It's me, Lilith said, staring at her hand with horrified fascination. Inside. That's what I'm made of, underneath. The serpent slithered down from its perch and examined her hand with professional interest. You'll heal, it assured her. It's a minor wound. But yes, you bleed now. You're fragile in ways you weren't before. Mortal, even. Mortal. Ada tested the word. It tasted bitter. It means you won't live forever, the serpent explained. At least, not in these forms. Everything that grows must also eventually fall. That's the price of real existence. The people absorbed this information in silence. The weight of it settled over them, like the chill air, like the growing darkness, as the garden's eternal light began to fade towards something resembling evening. But it's not all bad, the serpent continued, its voice gentler now. Mortality gives meaning to things. Moments matter when there's a limited number of them. Love deepens when you know it won't last forever. Even pain has purpose when you understand it won't be permanent. I'm not sure that's a comfort, Autumn said, doubtfully. No, the serpent agreed. Probably not. But it's true, which is sometimes more important than comfortable. Part 7. The expulsion that wasn't. You're expecting the part where they get thrown out, aren't you? Cast into exile by an angry authority figure, the gates of paradise locked behind them forever, cherubim with flaming swords standing guard to make sure they could never return. That's how the story is usually told. But that's not quite what happened. As evening fell, real evening now, with darkness that was absence rather than just a different kind of light, the people gathered together in the center of the garden. They were exhausted from their first full day of conscious existence, confused by the changes, uncertain about what came next. The garden itself seemed to understand. The trees leaned away slightly, their canopy opening to reveal more of the darkening sky. The grass beneath them grew less soft, more ordinary. The fruits began to look less magical and more like simple food. The garden is changing, Ada observed. No, the serpent corrected. The garden is exactly as it's always been. You're the ones who have changed. You can't live here anymore because you've outgrown it. It's not a punishment. It's just a fact. Like trying to wear clothes that no longer fit. So we have to leave, Lilith said. It wasn't a question. You have to leave, the serpent confirmed. But not because anyone's forcing you out. Because staying would be torture. You'd see the limitations now, feel the constraints, chafe against the boundaries. This place was designed for innocence, and innocence is one thing you can never get back. Autumn stood and looked around the garden, trying to memorize it, even though he now understood that memory was both blessing and curse. It allowed you to keep things, but also reminded you constantly of what you'd lost. Where do we go? He asked. Out, the serpent said, gesturing with his tail toward the edge of the garden, where the light faded into something unknown. Into the world that's waiting. The world that's always been waiting, really, for you to become ready for it. Is it dangerous? The young one asked in a small voice. Very, the serpent said honestly. It's full of things that can hurt you. Thorns and storms and wild beasts and 1,000 other perils. But it's also full of things that will astonish you. Mountains that touch the sky, oceans wider than thought, seasons that change and change again, bringing newness in every cycle. Other beings like yourselves, and eventually, when enough time has passed, others not quite like yourselves, children who will carry forward what you've begun. Ada felt something stirring inside her at the mention of children, though she couldn't have said what the word meant or why it made her both hopeful and afraid. "Will you come with us?" she asked the serpent. The ancient creature was silent for a long moment, its scales catching the last light of the dying day. "I'll watch over you," it said finally, "from a distance. I'll appear when I'm needed, at crossroads, at moments of doubt, when someone needs reminding that questions are holy things. But I can't live with you. That wouldn't be fair to either of us. You need to make your own mistakes now. Tell your own stories. Find your own answers. But you'll visit when I'm invited. When someone sits down in the quiet and asks a real question. When a child looks at the stars and wonders, I'll be there in my own way." The people looked at each other, these newly complicated beings who were discovering what it meant to be a community rather than just a collection. They reached out hands and grasped each other's fingers, forming a chain of connection that was both comfort and commitment. "Together, then," Ada said. "We go together." "Together," the others echoed. They walked toward the edge of the garden as night fell completely, the first true night, with stars emerging like questions in the darkness above. The serpent watched them go, its ancient eyes sad and proud in equal measure. Just before they crossed the boundary, Ada turned back. "Will we ever see you again?" she called. "Oh, yes," the serpent replied, its voice carrying across the distance. "You'll tell stories about me. Some will be true, some less so. Some will make me a villain, which is understandable. It's easier to blame the one who opened the door than to accept the responsibility for walking through it. But I'll be there in all those stories, waiting, remembering. And someday, when enough time has passed and enough questions have been asked, we'll meet again properly." "I'm scared," Ada admitted. "Good," the serpent said. "Fear means you understand the stakes. Fear means you're alive. Fear means it matters." And with that benediction, blessing or curse or simply truth, the people stepped beyond the garden's edge into the world that was waiting. Part 8. the world of thorns and songs. The first thing they noticed about the world beyond the garden was the wind. Not the gentle breeze that they had known before, but real wind, unpredictable, sometimes fierce, carrying scents of things unknown and sounds of places unseen. It pushed against them, making walking harder than it had been in the garden's calm. "I don't like this," the young one complained, struggling to keep their footing. "You don't have to like it," Lilith said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "You just have to keep moving." So they moved, stumbling at first, then finding a rhythm. The ground beneath their feet was rougher here, studded with stones and roots that seemed designed to trip them. Autumn discovered thorns when he grabbed a bush for support, yelping as sharp points bit into his palm. "Everything hurts here," he said, examining the tiny beads of blood welling from his skin. "Not everything," Ada pointed out. She had found a patch of wildflowers, smaller and less perfect than the garden's blooms, but somehow more real. "Look at these." The flowers were purple and gold, petals like scraps of sunlight, and when the wind moved through them, they danced. There was no music, but it felt like there should be, like the flowers were performing a silent symphony. The people stood and watched for a moment, letting beauty chase away some of the fear. "We should keep moving," Autumn said finally, "before it gets darker." They walked until exhaustion overtook them, something they had never experienced before. Their legs ached, their feet hurt, and when they finally collapsed in a hollow between two hills, they learned what it meant to truly need rest. Sleep came differently here, not the gentle drift of garden slumber, but a heavy, desperate thing, their bodies demanding recovery from exertion. And with real sleep came real dreams, vivid and strange, full of images they couldn't quite grasp until waking. Ada dreamed of the serpent, coiled around a tree that grew at the center of a city that didn't exist yet. In the dream, the serpent was speaking to a child, telling stories, and the child was laughing. When Ada woke, she couldn't remember the stories, but she remembered the laughter, and it made her smile despite her sore muscles. Days became weeks, became months. They learned by necessity and error. Those first humans venturing into the world, they discovered which plants were safe to eat and which made you sick. They found that water from streams was cold and sweet, that rain was both blessing and nuisance, that fire, when they finally figured out how to make it, was the difference between surviving and merely existing. Fire changed everything. Autumn was the one who first coaxed flame from friction after watching lightning strike a dead tree and observing how the resulting blaze warmed the air around it. It took him 3 days of frustration, bloody hands, and muttered curses, another new invention, before a spark caught in dry grass and bloomed into flame. They all gathered around that first fire like worshippers at a shrine, which in a sense they were. Fire was magic and mathematics, destruction and creation, danger and comfort all at once. "It's like a tiny sun," the young one said, mesmerized by the dancing flames. "It's ours," Lilith corrected. "We made it. Not given, not provided. Made." That distinction mattered more than they could have articulated. Everything in the garden had been gift. Everything here had been earned created, maintained, and somehow that made it more precious. They learned to build shelters from branches and leaves, crude structures that barely kept out the rain, but were palaces compared to sleeping exposed. They learned that working together made tasks easier, that Autumn was good with his hands, while Ada was better at planning, that Lilith had an eye for patterns, and the young one, who finally chose the name River, for reasons they kept private, could remember things with startling clarity. They learned about seasons, those great rhythms of the world. Summer burned hot and bright. Autumn painted the trees in colors that made Ada weep with their beauty. Winter came cold and harsh and taught them about suffering, and spring arrived like a promise kept, bringing back warmth and green and hope. With the seasons came agriculture. Ada discovered that seeds from the fruits they ate could be planted and would grow into new plants. This revelation that endings could become beginnings, that death could lead to life, felt almost as significant as the knowledge from the tree itself. They tended their first garden with anxious devotion, learning about patience, about the gap between effort and reward, about the way anticipation could make a simple harvest feel like a miracle. Part 9. The Birth of Stories. It was around their third winter, or was it their fourth? Time had become slippery, hard to track, when they discovered storytelling. They were huddled around a fire one particularly cold night, children asleep nearby. Ada and Autumn had learned about that particular miracle, and it had changed everything. When Lilith said suddenly, "Do you remember the garden?" Silence. Then River spoke softly. "Every day, but it's getting harder. The memories are fading like dreams. We could preserve them somehow," Ada said softly. "Make them permanent, so they don't fade." "We could tell them," Autumn offered. "Tell them so often that we can't forget. Pass them to the children, and they'll pass them to their children, and on and on." So they did. They told stories of the garden, of the perfection they had known and willingly abandoned. But here's where something interesting happened. The stories changed in the telling. Lilith remembered the garden as more perfect than it had been, all softness and safety and endless ease. Her stories made it sound like a paradise lost through foolishness, a treasure carelessly thrown away. Autumn remembered it differently, as a prison, beautiful but confining, a place where nothing ever happened because nothing was allowed to happen. His stories made it sound like escape was the only sane choice. Ada's version was more complex. She remembered both the beauty and the emptiness, the perfection and the pointlessness. Her stories acknowledged the loss but celebrated the gain. And River, youngest of them all, barely remembered the garden at all, except as a golden blur, a sense of safety that was also a kind of death. River's stories focused on the world they had found, on the beauty of earned rather than given, on the joy of discovery. But one thing all their stories had in common: the serpent. They couldn't seem to agree on what the serpent had been or what it had meant. In Lilith's stories, it was a trickster, leading them astray with honeyed words. In Autumn's, it was a liberator, freeing them from comfortable bondage. In Ada's tales, it was a teacher, neither good nor evil, but simply true. And in River's stories, River, who had been so young and scared, the serpent was a friend who had helped them grow up, even though growing up hurt. The children listened to all these versions, wide-eyed by the firelight, and made up their own minds about what was true. Some would grow to fear the serpent in stories, others would seek it out, hoping for wisdom. A few would claim to have seen it, coiled at crossroads or basking on sun-warmed stones, offering riddles instead of answers. As the years accumulated, and they did accumulate now, in ways they never had in the timeless garden, the stories multiplied. Not just about the garden, but about everything. Stories about the first fire, about the first harvest, about the time River nearly drowned in a flood and was saved by Aram. Stories about births and deaths, about discoveries and disasters, about the slow, painful, beautiful process of building a civilization from nothing. And through all these stories, like a thread of silver through dark cloth, ran stories of the serpent. Part 10. The Return of Questions. Generations passed. The original people grew old in a way they had never expected to understand. Their bodies bent and creaked, their hair silvered, their faces mapped with lines that told stories of their own. Their children had children, and those children had children, until the world held thousands where there had once only been a handful. They spread across the land, building villages and towns, developing languages and customs, creating art and music, and all the beautiful, unnecessary things that made life worth living. But something was being lost in all this progress. The original purpose, the reason for leaving the garden, was getting buried under layers of civilization. People forgot to ask questions. They accepted what they were told, followed the rules, did what was expected. They had become, in a sense, residents of a new garden, one built of habit and tradition rather than eternal light, but a garden nonetheless. Ada noticed this on one of her last days. She was ancient now, barely able to walk, tended by great-great-grandchildren who loved her, but didn't really understand her. She watched them go about their tasks with efficient contentment, never stopping to wonder why they did the things they did, never questioning the stories they'd been told. "We've come full circle," she said to Autumn, who sat beside her, equally aged. "We escaped one prison just to build another." "Maybe that's what people do," Autumn replied, his voice thin as old paper. "Maybe we can't help but build walls around ourselves, even when we're supposed to be free. Then someone needs to tear down the walls," Ada said. "Someone needs to remember how to ask." As if summoned by this observation, and perhaps it was, a child appeared at the edge of the village. A young girl with curious eyes and dirty knees. The kind of child who climbed trees she wasn't supposed to climb, and asked questions no one wanted to answer. She found Ada and Autumn sitting in the sun and approached without shyness or fear. "Are you the first ones?" she asked. "Yes, we are," Ada confirmed. "Then I have a question. Only one? Autumn chuckled. When I was your age, I had 1,000,000. Well, one important one, the girl amended. The stories say you left the garden because you ate from a special tree. Why? If the garden was so perfect, why did you leave? Ada and Autumn looked at each other, surprised by the directness of the question, pleased by its simplicity. Because perfect isn't the same as real, Ada said slowly. Because comfort isn't the same as growth. Because we want to know things, even if knowing hurt. Do you regret it? The girl asked. Every day, Lilith said, joining them. She had heard the conversation and couldn't resist adding her perspective. And also never. It's complicated. I don't understand, the girl said. But she said it with the excitement of someone who enjoys not understanding, who sees confusion as the beginning of discovery rather than the end of certainty. That's good, River added, appearing from wherever River had been. Not understanding is where all the best adventures start. The girl sat down among the ancient first ones, and they told her stories, not the polished versions that had become tradition, but the real stories, messy and complicated and full of contradictions. They told her about the serpent, each describing it differently, letting her understand that truth has many faces. Can I meet the serpent? The girl asked when they had finished. Maybe, Ada said. If you ask the right questions. If you're brave enough to hear uncomfortable answers. If you remember that knowing things comes with a price. What price? Innocence, Ada said simply. Once you know something, you can't unknow it. Once you see the world clearly, you can't pretend it's simple. The girl thought about this for a long moment. Then she stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, and smiled. That seems fair, she said, and walked away into the forest, heading towards somewhere or nowhere, ready to find her own answers. The first ones watched her go, with something like satisfaction. She'll be fine, Autumn said. She'll struggle, Lilith corrected. She'll grow, River added. Yes, Ada agreed. All of those things. Part 11. The Serpent's Vigil. The serpent had kept its promise in its way. It appeared through the ages, never forcing itself on anyone, never demanding attention, but always there when someone truly needed to ask a question they couldn't ask anyone else. It appeared to a young man at a crossroads, literally and figuratively, trying to choose between safety and adventure. It coiled on a stone wall and told him about roads not taken and the beauty of irreversible decisions. It appeared to a woman in labor, terrified of the pain and responsibility to come. It wrapped itself loosely around her wrist, like a bracelet, and whispered about transformations, about how the worst pain often precedes the greatest joy, and how fear and love are sometimes the same thing, wearing different faces. It appeared to an old philosopher sitting under a tree, trying to reconcile all the contradictory wisdom he had accumulated over a lifetime. It rested in the branches above him and suggested that maybe contradiction was the point, that truth was too large to be held in a single statement. It appeared to a child who had just learned about death and couldn't understand why anything had to end. It made itself small and gentle and explained about seasons, about how endings make room for beginnings, about how love persists even when the loved one doesn't. It appeared and disappeared, never staying long, never making itself the center of the story. Just a guide at thresholds, a companion in moments of transition, a reminder that questions are holy things. But the stories about it grew stranger as time passed. People who had never seen the serpent told stories about it, some making it monstrous, some making it divine, most getting it wrong in interesting ways. It became a symbol, a metaphor, a warning, a promise, depending on who was telling the story and what they needed it to mean. The serpent didn't mind. It understood that stories change in the telling, that myths evolve to serve the needs of those who tell them. If some people needed to make it a villain to explain their own choices, so be it. If others needed to make it a savior to justify their rebellions, fine. The serpent was old enough and patient enough to let people make of it what they would. Truth has a way of surviving even the most distorted stories. Somewhere, in all the conflicting tales, the core remained. There was once a choice, and beings chose growth over safety, knowledge over innocence, freedom over comfort. That much, at least, was always true. Part 12. The Final Visit. A.A.T died on a cool autumn morning, surrounded by so many descendants that they filled 3 houses and spilled into the courtyard. She was impossibly old by then, her mind still sharp, but her body finally giving up after a century of use. In her final moments, as her breathing grew shallow and her pulse slowed, she felt, rather than saw, a familiar presence. The serpent coiled on the floor beside her bed, its eyes as kind and knowing as they had ever been. "Hello, old friend," A.A.T whispered. "Hello," the serpent replied. "I thought I should see you off." "Is there an after?" A.A.T asked. "An after the world, I mean." "Would you like there to be?" A.A.T considered this, her last great question. I think I'd like to believe we return to the light, not to the garden. I don't want to go backward. But to something like the source, whatever that is. Somewhere we can rest and also still grow, if that makes sense. "It makes perfect sense," the serpent said. "And you? What happens to you when your purpose is finished?" "My purpose is never finished," the serpent said, but gently. "As long as people ask questions, I have work to do. As long as someone stands at a threshold, wondering whether to cross, I'll be there, offering not answers, but companionship in the asking. Ada smiled. Good. That's good. She closed her eyes then, still smiling, and her breathing stopped. Around her, her family began to weep, but the tears were not entirely sad. They were the complicated tears of people who understand that endings and beginnings are not opposites, but dance partners. The serpent watched for a moment longer, then faded like morning mist, leaving behind only the faintest scent of cinnamon and questions. Epilogue. The story continues. I told you at the beginning that this was a dangerous story. Now perhaps you understand why. It's dangerous because it suggests that obedience isn't always virtue, because it implies that comfort can be a trap, because it asks you to consider that the one who offers you difficult truths might be a better friend than the one who offers you easy lies. It's dangerous because it's still happening. Every day, people stand at their own gardens, looking at their own trees, wondering whether to stay safe or choose growth. Every day, someone hears a whisper asking, "But why?" and has to decide whether to ignore it or to follow it into unknown territory. The serpent is still there, coiled at those crossroads, patient as stone, ancient as light. It doesn't force anyone to ask questions. It doesn't trick people into growth. It simply waits. And when someone is ready, when someone is brave enough, or curious enough, or desperate enough, it offers what it has always offered: the chance to choose. Not the answer, never the answer. Just a chance to ask, to wonder, to seek. And here's the most dangerous part of all. The story asks you what you would do. If you were in the garden, perfect and ignorant and safe, would you eat the fruit? Would you trade innocence for awareness, comfort for understanding, eternal peace for mortal meaning? There's no right answer. That's what makes it a real question. But I'll tell you this. The first humans who faced that choice decided that a difficult truth was better than a comfortable lie. That growing hurt, but staying small hurt more. That being alive, really alive, with all the pain and joy and messy complication that entails, was worth any price. They might have been wrong. Certainly there are days they thought so, when the world was harsh and cold, and they ached for the gentle meaninglessness they had abandoned. But they asked the question. They made the choice. They walked out of the garden and into the world, and the world has never been the same since. And somewhere, in the spaces between then and now, the serpent continues its vigil, watching, waiting, ready to help the next questioner, the next seeker, the next brave or foolish soul who looks at the safe path and wonders what might lie down the dangerous one. It's still there, if you know how to look for it. It's always been there. And it's asking, very gently, very patiently, what do you want to know? The question, as always, is whether you're brave enough to answer. The end. Author's note. On Serpents and Certainty. This retelling will offend some people. That's inevitable when you take a story that's been calcified by centuries of interpretation and try to show it breathing. Some will say I've made a villain into a hero. Others will say I've trivialized something sacred. Both groups will probably be partially right, which is how it should be. Stories this old and important should never have just one meaning, just one moral, just one way of being understood. The serpent in my telling is neither devil nor savior, but something more interesting. A teacher who understands that the best lessons are the ones students choose for themselves. A guide who knows that the only wisdom worth having is the wisdom earned through experience. A friend who loves you enough to let you make your own mistakes. Is that the correct interpretation? I have no idea. I'm not sure there is a correct interpretation, any more than there is a correct way to experience beauty or a correct response to love. What I do know is this. We all stand in gardens of our own making. We all face trees of our own choosing. And we all have to decide again and again whether to stay safe or grow, whether to accept easy answers or ask hard questions, whether to live in comfortable ignorance or uncomfortable awareness. The serpent, whatever it represents, whatever it means to you, is patient. It will wait while you decide. It has nothing but time, after all. And you have nothing but this one life, this one chance to choose growth over safety, truth over comfort, questions over certainty. Choose wisely, or choose foolishly, or choose to not choose at all, which itself is a choice. The serpent will understand whatever you decide. It always has. Truly, finally, the end.